We shall propose further cooperative efforts between all the nations in weather prediction and eventually in weather control. We shall propose, finally, a global systems of communication satellites linking the whole world in telegraph and telephone and radio and television. The day need not be far away when such a system will televise the proceedings of this body to every corner of the world for the benefit of peace.
Kennedy was talking about weather control with confidence. In April of the previous year, the TIROS satellite had been launched from Cape Canaveral and equipped with solar power to send back images of cloud formations. The national press announced that TIROS, quote, opens up new vistas for weather forecasting and control, unquote. But developments in weather control had already been underway. In 1958, the military announced success with weather modification by sending powerful electromagnetic beams into the upper atmosphere using ionospheric heaters like the one at HAARP today.
But the scientific possibility of a world weather watch requires the attention of the World Meteorological Organization. Our goal is to investigate the world ocean, its boundaries, its processes. To a surprising extent, the sea has remained a mystery. 10,000 fleets still sweep over it in vain. We know less at the ocean of our feet, where we came from, than we do of the sky above our head. Scientists have studied the atmosphere for many decades, but its problems continue to defy us. The reasons for our limited progress are obvious. Weather cannot be easily reproduced and observed in the laboratory. It must therefore be studied in all of its violence wherever it has its way. Some of our most successful international efforts have involved the study of the atmosphere. We all know that the World Meteorological Organization has been effective in this field. It is now developing a worldwide weather system to which nations the world over can make their contribution. Such cooperative undertakings can challenge the world's best efforts for decades to come. But science has the power for the first time in history now to undertake experiments with premeditation which can irreversibly alter our biological and physical environment on a global scale. The problem is difficult because it is hard to know in advance whether the cumulative effects of a particular experiment will help or harm mankind. We must, for example, balance the gains of weather modification against the hazards of protracted drought or storm. The government has the clear responsibility to weigh the importance of large-scale experiments to the advance of knowledge or to national security against the possibility of adverse and destructive effects. The scientific community must assist the government in arriving at rational judgments and interpreting these issues to the public. To deal with this problem, we have worked out formal procedures within the government to assure expert review before potentially risky experiments are undertaken. And we will make every effort to publish the data needed to permit open examination and discussion of proposed experiments by the scientific community before they are authorized.
The hurricane is predicted to take. These artificial clouds will block the sun from evaporating more water to feed the hurricane. The reports coming into the control center indicate that the diversionary cloud seeding over Kansas is now creating a flood danger. Specially equipped robot aircraft are dispatched immediately to release a high concentration of cloud seeding material into the fringes of the storm. Heavier seeding from the ground also helps to subdue the rain by spreading it over a wider area. The controller calls for another view of the hurricane, which has now moved closer to the coast.
China is now looking at the skies. It has revealed plans to drastically expand on experimental weather modification program covering an area of more than 1.5 times the total size of India. China has long sought to control the weather by seeding clouds. The process works by injecting small amounts of chemicals like silver iodide into clouds, causing them to precipitate. The technology has been used to create artificial rain and snow, but the massive push, ostensibly for domestic use, is sending alarm bells ringing in India, especially in the context of the recent conflicts across the line of actual control. There are fears that weather modification could potentially give China an edge.
I mean, lasers? Really? To change the weather?
That's right. Well, we physicists are firing trillion-watt lasers into the sky to actually precipitate rain clouds and actually bring down lightning bolts. When you have water vapor and you have dust particles or ice crystals, you can precipitate rain. It condenses around the seeds. These seeds can also be created by laser beams. By firing trillion-watt lasers, you rip apart the electrons, creating what are called ions, and these ions act like seeds, like dust particles, bringing down rain and even lightning.
In part because, too, I remember reading the stories that China had used this during the Olympics, that the USSR had used this after Chernobyl to create rain clouds. I mean, did those really work then? We have some of these capabilities now?
Inconclusive. Even in the 60s, the CIA used this to bring down monsoons during the Vietnam War, to wash out the Viet Cong. Now, we realize that for decades now, these governments have been alleged to have experimented with weather control, but nothing conclusive. They're actually using trillion-watt lasers now. And in the laboratory, sure enough, they precipitate rain out of water vapor. Sure enough, you can actually bring down electricity down the beam. For floods, for agriculture, for farmers, for people planning wedding parties, football games, you name it, outdoor events and agriculture and flooding and even hurricanes. All of them could be subject to weather modification.
It's flying me to the edge of a violent thunderstorm.
You see how nice and crisp the top of that cloud is up there?
Yeah.
But the former commercial pilot isn't some adrenaline junkie courting danger. He's a cloud seeder, chasing this menacing storm to squeeze out extra rain for the drought-stricken farmland below.
As a pilot.
The UAE is one of the driest countries on Earth, with an annual rainfall of roughly 120 millimeters. As a result, it has to get creative when it comes to finding solutions for water. In the early 2000s, the UAE started performing regular cloud seeding operations. Cloud seeding is the process of increasing the amount of rain produced from clouds.
Some of these clouds, by nature, sometimes it rains, for example, only 40 to 50% of its rain that processed in the cloud that comes as rainfall. So by these operations, we try to increase this amount by, for example, from 15 to 30%.
So how does it work? It starts here, inside the National Center of Meteorology, where a team is constantly monitoring forecasts, looking for potential clouds to seed. The operations only work with cumulus clouds, which are vertical in shape.
Research 5 operation, can you read me?
Once they spot a cloud, they radio the pilots, who then take to the air armed with hydroscopic flares filled with a mixture of potassium chloride, sodium chloride, magnesium, and other materials. It's essentially salt. When the plane reaches the right clouds, the pilots release the flares.
These salts basically attracts the moisture and try to make it condense. So these particles becomes nuclei of condensation, and then when these droplets condense, and then they hit each other, and then they form a bigger droplet that the air cannot hold it any longer in the air, so it forms as rain.
In 2017, the UAE performed 242 cloud seeding operations. The government is confident the operations are increasing the amount of rainfall, but it's difficult to gauge.
Until now, there is no way that you can measure the success rate for each individual clouds. There are no two clouds are the same, and you don't know, for example, before actually you see the cloud, is it going to rain by itself or not, and by how much?
The country has also invested in rain research, offering millions of dollars in grant money to innovative researchers and projects.
don't want us to survive out here.
He's part of a team of scientists and military backers on the cutting edge of a new technology, making lasers powerful enough to reach up here into the sky where a thunderstorm is just about to start. In the near future, a push-button storm starter could be a real thing. It comes off of much higher power beams than this one. The problem is those pops have always had trouble getting into the sky. Now Matt has discovered a way to get the laser to pop all the way in the clouds. In theory, that's what starts a storm.
Meanwhile, Bill Gates is backing the first high-altitude experiment of one radical climate change solution, creating a massive chemical cloud that could cool the Earth. It's called solar geoengineering, and it's highly controversial. Thousands of planes would fly very high and use nozzles to inject millions of tons of light-reflecting particles into the stratosphere. It would create a thin chemical cloud of those particles around the whole planet, blocking some sunlight from reaching the surface. It would mimic a giant volcanic eruption, which we know cools the Earth. Back in 1991, Mount Pinatubo erupted in the Philippines. It was the largest eruption to affect a densely populated area, creating avalanches and giant mud flows that left more than 700 dead and 30,000 homeless. It also spewed a cloud of 20 million tons of sulfur dioxide particles into the stratosphere. That chemical cloud was hundreds of miles across and reflected about 2% of sunlight back to space. And in 1992, the Earth was cooler than in 1991.
That is part of the mechanism, but you do this in a controlled way.
But it also comes with significant risks and uncertainties.
Things like mass famine, mass flooding, drought, of kinds that will affect very large populations.
You can also compare it to direct air carbon capturing, another climate change solution backed by Bill Gates and by big oil. It involves sucking billions of tons of carbon out of the air. And at $100 to $200 a ton, it could be big business. Bill Gates is among a dozen individual donors and 14 foundations backing the first stratospheric solar geoengineering experiment out of Harvard. It's called Stratospheric Controlled Perturbation Experiment, or SCOPEX. A high-altitude balloon will lift instruments about 20 kilometers into the stratosphere, where it will release less than 2 kilograms of different naturally occurring chemicals, like calcium carbonate and sulfates, and then measure the change in atmospheric chemistry and light scattering. The Harvard group that runs SCOPEX and other experiments has raised more than $16 million, more than double any other solar geoengineering effort. But developing a new high-altitude tanker would not be technologically difficult or prohibitively expensive. Nozzles still need to be designed that can continuously blast out trillions of particles, and scientists still need to decide what chemicals those particles should be made of. But unlike cloud brightening, which is another solar reflection technique, the tech needed for stratospheric injections is not far off.
It is the general scientific consensus that climate change is causing an increase in extreme weather events around the world.
Oh my God.
From sea level rises to droughts, extreme weather can seriously cripple affected communities. But what is considered an extreme weather event? Extreme weather can be very dramatic, with fire tornadoes, wildfires, severe tropical storms, hurricanes, and cyclones being the prime examples. According to the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, an extreme weather event is an occurrence that is more severe than the historical norm. They point out that even statistically, non-extreme weather events can cause significant damage to economies, societies, ecosystems, and infrastructure. As of 2012, there have been more than 800 major extreme weather events recorded worldwide, causing hundreds of billions of dollars in damage. Other sources, like the UK Met Office, show a marked increase in extreme events which caused loss from just over 200 in 1980 to over 700 in 2015. In the U.S. alone, the National Climate Assessment indicates that events like heat waves, heavy downpours, and major hurricanes have noticeably increased in frequency and strength over the last decades. In fact, over the past 30 years, the United States has experienced some of the worst weather events in its history. Take Hurricane Katrina, for example. In August of 2005, the hurricane hit Florida as a Category 1 and evolved into a much more powerful Category 3 along the eastern Louisiana, western Mississippi coastlines. This storm damaged infrastructure and ultimately led to the levee system of New Orleans being overwhelmed. More than 1,800 people lost their lives, and repair costs were estimated to be more than $160 billion. Not to mention the wildfires that ravaged Australia at the beginning of 2020 and the recent fire tornadoes in California. Are these extreme weather events really a consequence of climate change? Or are we just more aware of these events in a world of social media and minute-to-minute reporting? Many experts certainly believe global warming is behind the increasing frequency of these events, but humans aren't all to blame. The IPCC, for example, notes that extreme weather events are also the result of natural climate variability, as well as decadal or multi-decadal variations in the climate, which provide the backdrop for anthropogenic climate changes. In other words, events like El Niño would occur with or without human impact on the climate. Some studies in Europe have noted a significant uptick in floods and other hydrological events over the last 5 years. However, even the IPCC admits that while there is evidence that increases in greenhouse gases have likely caused changes in some types of extremes, there is no simple answer to the question of whether the climate in general has become more or less extreme. For many nations, the first port of call is the passing of various legislation and bills to prioritize actions to be taken, like reducing emissions, improving weather forecasting, and disaster response systems. The protection of key strategic resources like agriculture, fuel and energy, fresh water supplies, and livestock may need to take priority. To protect food supplies, nations are experimenting with drought-tolerant seeds, expanding irrigation, and improving seasonal weather forecasting. They are also improving management and animal husbandry practices to make these more resilient to extreme weather events. Freshwater supplies are also a high priority for most nations. For drought-prone areas, surface and groundwater capture and storage systems, as well as desalination systems, are being developed. Flood defense systems are being upgraded around the world by beefing up levees and storm drainage systems.
The Paris Climate Accord is simply the latest example of Washington entering into an agreement that disadvantages the United States.
residents in Goulburn in South Australia, it was reality. They had a horrifying shock when thousands of baby spiders quite literally rained down from the sky. The town was invaded by the creepy crawlies as homes and gardens were reportedly covered with the spiders and mounds of their silky threads.
Welcome to the southern Brazilian town of Santo Antônio da Platina. Today's weather forecast, about 82 degrees and cloudy with a 100% chance of raining spiders. No, you're not dreaming. This isn't a nightmare. This video, shot by a 20-year-old web designer, shows a strange phenomenon where a group of social spiders create massive sheets of webs to catch food.
Residents of Memphis, Tennessee have described feeling like they were in a horror film after waking up to a giant spider web in their neighborhood. Stretching nearly 800 meters, the web was accompanied by thousands of spiders. Overwhelmed local residents have asked city authorities to step in to help get rid of them.
humans. The Air Force conducted a study starting in 1993. It was called In Vitro Toxicity of Aluminum Nanoparticles in Rat Alveolar Macrophages. That's a real fancy way of saying testing the effect of aluminum nanoparticles on the white blood cells in the little air sacs in your lung, the alveoli. And what they found in this 8-year study was that these particles, when you're exposed to them long enough, it suppresses the ability of your white blood cells to defend you from airborne infections coming into your lungs. So it suppresses your immune system. But they also found that these same particles, once they get into your system, they can actually go through the barrier in each one of the cells. They get inside the cells, and these particles can actually suppress the ability of mitochondria, which are in the cells that help to gobble up toxins and things that would be harmful to the nucleus and the reproduction process of the cells in your body. These processes are suppressed, and so essentially by breathing this material in, your immune system is dramatically suppressed.
If you've noticed today, many places that you go, everybody's got that cough that doesn't seem ever to go away. It's frightening because my healthy patients have had it, my sick patients have had it. It has seemed to have plagued everybody, and no one seemed to be spared from enjoying this hack at one time or another. It's extremely difficult to get, and it doesn't seem to be dependent on your immune system, which makes me suspicious that it's coming from an external source. An interesting article came across the internet a few months ago that talked about the chemtrail flu.
I'm telling you about the massive flu outbreak this year, but not everyone with flu symptoms may actually have the flu. Instead, it could be something that you've probably never heard of.
Yeah, the Centers for Disease Control published a report this week about adenovirus. The military is vaccinated against it, and the report suggests maybe civilians should be too, especially people in close quarters. What is adenovirus? We're in the middle of a severe flu season across the country, and Pittsburgh is not immune.
My daughter and her fiance both had the flu.
A lot of people in my office had the flu.
While some people are tested specifically for the flu, the CDC published report suggests an infection most people don't know about can feel like the flu. Have you ever heard of adenovirus?
I have not heard of it.
Adenovirus is a very common virus. We see it a lot in the younger population, which is can be spread person to person, but typically it's not as severe as the flu.
Adenovirus symptoms include fever, sore throat, headache, body aches, and diarrhea. There is a vaccine, but it's only licensed for military use.
The reason for this is because obviously for military recruits that are younger, they're cohorted in an area where they're all together. So you have the potential, if you have an airborne respiratory virus, to get everybody sick.
The author of the report says because doctors typically don't test for it, it's hard to tell how prevalent it actually is. But the virus is reportedly believed to survive on some surfaces for as long as a month. So the advice to avoid getting sick is the same as with other infections.
What we're seeing now, and I first could not believe it, and I started looking at the skies, and these are not normal. They're not natural. There's something going on. I don't know who it is or why they're doing it. All I can testify is it's not natural and it's not normal. It's got to be some outside influence doing that. Thank you.
I'm here to give you testimony that chemtrails, they're not contrails, are indeed real. They're spraying almost every day. I watch the clouds and watch the spraying program going on. I want to tell you that we're in very great danger from the pollution that's coming down over us. And we've been led astray by the military-industrial complex, and they're responsible for the cloud's creation and weather manipulation programs. They're dark operations. That's why they're not out in the media.
I look around and I see people are starting to look up and see this. Many times I've spoken about chemtrails, and I get this blank look on my face. What are you talking about? I'm saying, look up. As a pilot, before I fly, I look up. And so, boy, they're really out there working.
When you look up at the sun and you see a white haze, that is aluminum floating in the air right now, and it's coming from the aircraft.
There's a huge amount of aluminum being found because these sprays have aluminum, strontium, barium, manganese. And there's a lot of argument that aluminum is very common to be found. But aluminum is only common in a bonded form. It's not common in a free form, and we're finding high rates of free aluminum in the soil, which is not natural.
The metal compounds that are being used are environmentally dangerous. We need to be monitoring them. We need to be testing them.
You want some figures? Okay, latest water test. Tested the rain. 13,100 micrograms per liter of aluminum in the rain in 2013. Normally, it should be 0. So 13,100 is pretty damn much, folks. It used to be 0. Then it was 100s in the 2000s. And then since 2010, it's into the 1,000s and the latest 13,100. In the snow on Mount Shasta, pristine Mount Shasta, 61,000 micrograms per liter, 4 times the amount that is found in the soil up there. Where in the hell is this stuff coming from if it's not coming from the soil?
We have clouds in the sky we've never seen before. Almost every day I'm seeing clouds I've never seen before. And NASA has been even named a few of these new clouds. It's really interesting, but NASA is a corporation. I want you to know that.
NASA has also conducted a research program in what they call metallized fuels. We're actually putting aluminum oxide right in the fuel because it has 2 atoms of aluminum and 3 atoms of oxygen. So during the combustion process, it releases all that oxygen and dramatically increases efficiency, but it leaves the aluminum in the air.
We got things coming from sky down, and it's a huge, huge problem. Because as it comes down, what happens is a couple of things. Is that it actually is in our air, we breathe it. And as we breathe it, it's actually going to go up through our nostrils, into our brain, easiest access to our brain frontal lobe. The contaminants that have been identified, which already been mentioned, are aluminum. Aluminum is the #1 free radical generator to the brain to cause early apoptosis, which is early death of brain, and it begins to set off the scar tissue, which we call the amygdalin, which is part of the chemical matrix related to Alzheimer's.
I'm a neurologist practicing in Reading for 17 years, and in the past 5 years, I have seen the number of patients with Alzheimer's disease, Parkinson's, and other neurodegenerative diseases tremendously increase, almost quadruple.
I concur about the increasing number of Alzheimer's. They have been able to take the aluminum and micronize it, which means it'll stay up longer. But it also means, and I don't know if any of you have noticed some metallic taste in your mouth when they're spraying, but you inhale that, it goes up through your cribriform plate and through your sinuses and into the brain.
As you heard, to spray nanoparticles, very small particles. These nanoparticles, they basically trigger a programmed cell death in the brain, and that is the ultimate path we see in Alzheimer's.
That's problem number 1, because when we look at the Alzheimer issue, we say those are the old. The real problem is, and the real scare I have, is as I am a father of 2, I'm a grandfather of 3, so the drama is our children. ADD started in the 70s. Autism was not on the radar. There was no documents, there was no information. It was 1 in 100,000 children. Today, what we have is 1 in 48 boys. I was part of the early group that was looking for aluminum in ADD and ADHD. And all of those children that started to develop those phenomena had high levels of aluminum. When we figured out protocols to detox them out, to free the body of those particular contaminants, what happened is that their brains came back. When we do this to the age, it doesn't come back as quick, but it will come back. But I'm seeing Alzheimer's in 56 years old. Back in the 70s, Alzheimer's when you were 80.
I personally tested water and aluminum, and I found aluminum had 47 times the normal expected amounts. Strontium had 10 to 20 times the amounts. Barium was 20 times. This is what the stuff looks like here. Collected, most people just think it's a cobweb, but I tested it. It has outrageous amounts of barium, strontium, and aluminum, but they destroy the sample, so I'm not letting this get away from me.
These tests are international in scope. We're seeing this all over the world, guys. Okay. pH of acid soils is 20 times more alkaline. The aluminum in the soil has doubled in the last 10 years. The rain normal was 5.6. It's 20 times more alkaline. Aluminum blocks essential nutrients. I am unable in my garden to restore normal pH, and that's because nanoparticles are now in the circulatory systems of both plants and humans.
I wrote to the federal government because Air Force wrote a book, and on the first page of the book, they said, we're going to control the weather by the year 2025. I asked them, what are they doing spraying these chemicals on the public? I said, there's violation of United States Code 50 USC 1520, which prohibits the American government from experimenting on the U.S. citizens with chemical agents. I said that law also requires who's ever experimenting, when the federal government does it, that they have to report to Congress within 30 days. They wrote back, they said they don't know what I'm talking about. We have enough evidence that there's a spraying going all over the place.
We were warned about the takeover of our freedoms by the military-industrial complex by both Eisenhower and Kennedy. They're gaining traction on us, folks. We are in trouble more than just a spraying program.
Just as terrorist attacks threaten our communities, extreme weather disrupts the security of our nation. Extreme weather strains our resources, diverts attention from counterterrorism efforts, serves as a threat multiplier that aggravates stressors both at home and abroad, and destabilizes the lifeline sectors on which we rely.
Applied for patents that could make some of these ideas real. Many claim that these patents have become the blueprint for HAARP, High Frequency Active Auroral Research Program.
ARCO originally approached me in 1984 to find a use for the natural gas on the North Slope of Alaska, which they could not sell. To give you a feel for how much gas they asked me to find an application for, it was enough gas to produce all the electricity in the United States for a full year. I originated some ideas for military applications and beneficial civilian applications in which that gas would be converted into electricity and then used to power some gigantic antennas.
What does HAARP do? HAARP is a large antenna where we beam radio frequency energy up into the upper atmosphere, and we create on a small scale what the sun normally does. And the reason we're trying to do this is because when you have disturbances in the ionosphere, we can't communicate with our satellites.
HAARP began with a congressional insertion in the appropriations bill of fiscal year 1990. In essence, Congress directed the Defense Department to explore the potential for using the auroral regions for improving communications and navigation and surveillance. From there, the assignment came that the Navy and the Air Force were to manage the program. It is people from those two organizations that have worked together for the past 7 years.
Applications discussed in the patents included destroying missiles. Communications control and disruption were included. There were some other ideas both to possibly modify weather and finally to lift a portion of the upper atmosphere further out into space where hopefully it would be able to deflect missile trajectories.
What we do by beaming up radio frequency up into the ionosphere, that radio frequency, when it hits molecules of atmosphere, it tends to make the subatomic particles inside move faster, and that increases their temperature. So you can bring their temperature up to 1,600 degrees or so, which is normally what the sun does to those particles at that atmosphere.
The ionosphere of the Earth
has got enormous amount of energy. There are 8,000 thunderstorms going on all over the Earth at any given moment. There are millions of amperes of electricity pouring to the Earth from lightning strikes, and HAARP could create a trigger effect.
HAARP uses 1 billion watts beamed straight into the ionosphere for experiments.
While we feel that HAARP is a unique facility, it's not the only one like it in the world. HAARP has some capabilities that we feel are better than some of the others. You can change the frequencies. You can shift the beam so that you can move it from one part of the ionosphere to another, and it has quite a bit more power than some of the other facilities throughout the world that are doing the same kinds of research.
I chose what's called a phased array antenna for the patents because it can be aimed, and that is the kind that HAARP has built.
What we can do with an antenna is change the portion of the sky into which we insert the energy.
HAARP can create some of the effects that the sun creates that are similar to the aurora borealis.
HAARP can paint designs in the sky, if you will. You know, it can take the beam and move it in any pattern that the scientist who's doing an experiment might want to do.
HAARP focuses 3.6 million watts and squeezes it into a 1 billion watt or gigawatt beam.
We're squeezing the megawatts into a narrow beam, then in a very tiny area you can create what's it called, an effective gigawatt.
Is HAARP safe? Yes, HAARP is safe.
And HAARP is playing with the energy system of the Earth.
This was the planning document that really brought HAARP into being, and the absolute requirements ran from 1 gigawatt, which is 1 billion watts, all the way up to 10 billion watts of effective radiated power with a desired level of 100 billion watts.
The first module is what's called a developmental prototype, and that's 48 antennas in a 6x8 array.
What you're looking at is the HAARP site in Alaska, or at least about 1/5 of the HAARP site. When this is completed, you'll see about 180 of these poles. Together, those 180 poles make up one single antenna, designed along with these cross members and a wire mesh here to send all the information, all the radio frequency energy that is generated by these trailers up into the ionosphere.
The military record explains it as phase 1 of a multi-phase project. It's going to get bigger, it's going to continue, and that's again why we're concerned.
There's always a limit to everything, although we don't know exactly where that limit is.
We are surrounded and bombarded by millions of megawatts of natural energy because the sun blows a solar wind which crashes towards the Earth. Since the Earth is a giant magnet, the magnetic field called the magnetosphere protects us. HAARP's original patents were designed to distort or alter the magnetosphere. HAARP's combined antennae generate a focused 1 billion watt high-frequency radio beam which penetrates the lower ionosphere and interacts with the currents of the auroral electrojet. During this modification, this pulsing beam stimulates the ionosphere, creating ELF waves which can move great distances through the lower atmosphere and penetrate into the Earth to find missile silos, underground tunnels, and communicate with hidden submarines.
There's a current flowing through here called the auroral electrojet. You deposit energy in there, you're changing the medium, okay, and you're changing the current, and you're generating ELF and VLF waves.
They intend to cause it to dip down closer to the Earth so it can be tapped for a huge electrical power generating station, which is insanity because they don't know what they're dealing with. They're dealing with the planet's electrical system.
The electrojet affects global weather. Sometimes during a magnetic storm, for instance, it touches the Earth. It can knock out telephone cables and power grids.
What HAARP is capable of doing is to modify the electrojet. By modifying the electrojet, that current in the ionosphere, it has a capability of generating low-frequency waves.
We, in fact, are doing experiments, or plan to do experiments, to see if we can detect tunnels underground.
There is a way of being able to use this type of technology to be able to look for minerals that can be just below the surface of the earth. Oil, gas, different types of ore.
HAARP can be used to explore oils or gold mine and the like. Basically because the signal, low frequency signal, can penetrate deeper into the earth or the water or the ocean than the high frequency signal.
We are immersed in ELF waves, and those, as far as I know, maybe they are affecting us, but but these waves are minuscule compared to those.
I wanted to ask a couple questions here about HAARP, the High Frequency Active Auroral Research Program. Several of you at the table have a little bit of a piece here. As you know, this is located up in Alaska. It's currently funded by the Air Force Research Lab. It was formerly funded by the Office of Naval Research. One of the prime customers is DARPA, which is currently running experiments at the facilities here. So questions to several of you this morning. I'm told by the president of the University of Alaska that the Air Force has pulled its support for the facility, and they're taking steps to demolish it or take it down this summer. He's making the argument that there is other opportunities for us, and is trying to find a path where the university might be able to take title to the facility. I'd like to start with you, Dr. Prabhakar. I understand that a lot of folks here on the committee probably don't understand what HAARP does. I think most Alaskans don't really know what HAARP does or why the agency is involved in it. So a very brief explanation, and then a more direct question. Would you be disappointed, or would you lose something if HAARP were to go away?
Senator Murkowski, as I think you know, one of our programs has been using the HAARP facility for the research that it's pursuing. And my understanding is that we did get value out of that interaction. The P in DARPA is projects, and we're not in the business of doing the same thing forever. And so very naturally, as we conclude that work, we're going to move on to other topics. So it's not an ongoing need for DARPA, despite the fact that we had actually gotten some good value out of that infrastructure in the past.
Understood. Then to Dr. Walker and Mr. Schaefer then, Dr. Walker, your agency is currently running the facility. I've mentioned that it's our understanding through the president of UAF that the plans are to move forward and demolish the facility this summer. So the question to you is that accurate? Can you explain why? And then perhaps to both you and Mr. Schaefer, is there any benefit in exploring a potential relationship with the University of Alaska to perhaps take over the HAARP?
Yeah, thank you, Senator. The Air Force has gotten great value out of HAARP in the past. We took over from the Navy and managed it, and actually did a number of experiment campaigns up there, and have finished our work that we're interested in doing up there. We've moving on to other ways of managing the ionosphere, which the HAARP was really designed to do, was to inject energy into the ionosphere to be able to actually control it.
something that can actually control or perhaps harness the weather.
Geoengineering and weather manipulation is nothing new, but has been around for over 150 years. Weather modification has been something that the United States and many other governments have been working on for years, including Project Storm Fury, which is a US project that focused on controlling the storm paths of hurricanes. Since geoengineering and weather modification goes back so far, it is clear what the agenda is for weather manipulation. Weather modification dates at least back to the 1830s, when the proposals of American meteorologist James Pollard Espy to stimulate rain by controlled forest burning led to him becoming feted as the Storm King. More recently, the US Project Storm Fury sought for 2 decades to modify the paths of hurricanes through seeding them with silver iodide. The Royal Society, Geoengineering the Climate. HAARP, or High Frequency Active Auroral Research Program, has been known for its testing with geoengineering. Geoengineering is the alteration or manipulation of the weather. HAARP was a facility that used ionospheric heaters to change the weather. Although we are told that HAARP shut down years ago, there are many more facilities just like this all over the world. For instance, there's the Sura Ionospheric Heating Facility in Russia, the High Power Auroral Stimulation Observatory, or HIPAS, in Fairbanks, Alaska, the Arecibo Observatory in Puerto Rico, and ISCAT, which operates many facilities across the world stemming from Sweden. David Icke once said, "We now know that the ability to relocate weather systems with electromagnetic weapons and skies seeded with conductive aerosols is the key to the creation of artificial global warming." Global warming is a lie created specifically by the Club of Rome. The propaganda portrayed by the mainstream media about global warming is that the population must pay carbon taxes to Al Gore, as if they would use that money to prevent the Earth from rapidly heating. HAARP controlling the weather is a powerful weapon that can be and will be utilized by the powers ruling our world. By controlling weather, governments can cause fake natural disasters and have massive impacts on agriculture and growing food by changing the climate. Using false disasters would be a great way to open FEMA camps and begin full-phase New World Order with everyone enslaved. Some declassified documents from the US government detail injecting nanofibers and mechanized dust into the air. These nanofibers are being sprayed into the air and are found in chemtrail samples. Biometric Application Programming Interfaces, or BioAPIs, are sprayed onto people through nanobots, released through chemtrails, making it easier to manipulate and control the minds of humans. One of the most sinister and difficult to fathom conspiracy theories I've ever come across posits that nanobots are being sprayed on us all to install BioAPIs, Biometric Application Programming Interfaces, which basically allow for the mental and emotional remote control of humanity. These nanofibers, which have already been found in several chemtrail samples and linked to Morgellons disease, work by attaching themselves to neurons or synapses and self-replicating until they have artificially encapsulated and rewired your brain. Microdust weaponry, a mechanical analog to micron-sized mechanized dust, which is distributed as an aerosol and inhaled into the lungs. Dust mechanically bores into lung tissue and executes various pathological missions. A wholly new class of weaponry, which is legal. Dennis M. Bushnell, a NASA employee, Future Strategic Issues, Future Warfare, circa 2025.
However, NASA does need to test these engines once in a while. So they built this place, in the wetlands of Mississippi.
Choice. Stay, and you'll never hear another television program as long as you live. Or take the NASA shilling and get out. No one stayed. And NASA ended up with exactly what it wanted. 125,000 acres of nothing.
They even had to move 5 cemeteries, because the noise they were planning on making would wake the dead. Don't worry if you can't hear what I'm saying. I couldn't even hear myself. This is the loudest sound you could possibly conceive. And, as it turns out, the cleanest.
Now, the most amazing thing is that that cloud up there, which was generated by the engine, is just a mixture of hydrogen and oxygen. It's water vapor. And in about an hour's time, someone in Mississippi is going to get wet washing. It will actually rain. I told you, it's raining. That's unbelievable. Oh. NASA's playing God. It's making its own weather.
Well, throughout history, massive volcanic eruptions have had damaging effects to our planet and its people. Well, scientists at NASA are now trying to prevent future events, which they say may just be the only way to save the human race.
Supervolcanic eruptions have had some devastating effects on our planet and all those on it. Therefore, experts at NASA are working on some risky strategies to prevent one from happening, since we may be on the brink of one erupting very soon. Yellowstone National Park in Wyoming is famous for its tranquil geysers and hot springs. But beneath its beautiful surface of the park lies a massive volcanic chamber that could be on the verge of exploding. According to the United States Geological Survey, 3 extremely large explosive eruptions have occurred at Yellowstone in the past 2.1 million years, with a reoccurrence interval of about 600,000 to 800,000 years. The most recent took place 640,000 years ago, suggesting that Yellowstone is overdue for an eruption. But outlets like geysers and hot springs at the park can bleed out some heat, delaying the inevitable eruption. And when NASA experts analyzed the problem, they thought the most logical solution would be to cool the volcano down. NASA has a plan to drill a hole into the side of the volcano and pump water through it. When the water comes back out, it'll be heated to over 600 degrees, slowly cooling the volcano. The team hopes that given enough time, this process will take enough heat from the volcano to prevent it from ever erupting. According to the BBC, Brian Wilcox, a former member of the NASA Advisory Council on Planetary Defense, talked about the actual devastation that could come from an eruption and the risky techniques that the agency is considering for preventing one, including ways that could potentially set one off. The possible plan would drill into the bottom of the Yellowstone volcano using high-pressure water to release heat from the magma chamber. But Wilcox said this could be very risky. He told the BBC this can make the cap over the magma chamber more brittle and prone to fracture, and you might trigger the release of harmful volatile gases in the magma at the top of the chamber, which would otherwise not be released. Although NASA is considering other plans, it seems that cooling down the volcano could work even though it's a risky process. And it's not cheap either. The plan would be around an estimated $4.5 billion.
Yellowstone National Park attracts millions of visitors each year to see its geysers spew water hundreds of feet into the air. But the source of that heat is a supervolcano fed by a massive magma reservoir. If it erupts, it could spell disaster for humanity. While scientists agree that it's unlikely to happen anytime soon, An eruption would shoot more than 1,000 cubic kilometers of rock and ash into the air, blanketing the skies of the United States and creating a volcanic winter over the planet. NASA researchers have proposed a solution: drill 10 kilometers deep into the supervolcano and pump water down under high pressure. This would slowly lower the temperature day by day, thereby avoiding an eruption. The project comes with a price tag of $3.46 billion, which seems like a hefty amount, but that's only 0.5% of the Pentagon's $700 billion budget for 2018 and less than 1/10 of the $56 billion increase from 2017 to 2018. The plan could also be used to create a geothermal plant, harnessing the volcano's energy to supply the entirety of the continental United States. But building an unsightly power plant in the middle of the national park may prove unpalatable for many and could damage the unique chemistry of the geysers, though some scientists argue that careful drilling to harness the geothermal power could avoid such an environmental impact. Meanwhile, the clock is ticking to find a way to prevent an eruption that could make this Hollywood production become reality.